Thank you, Jaina. Thank you, CLPR. Thank you for inviting me to this fantastic panel. And this is the third TransForm conference that I am part of. And I'm going to talk about what we have been working on for the past few years, especially what I see is almost like yesterday's language. The language of labor rights is sort of is increasingly seeming to be something that people don't talk about anymore. It's not the flavor of the season, but I'm sort of trying to invoke it because there are some fantastic histories that one has come to know of, speaking with grassroots activists, speaking with trans women on the ground. So I think I wanted to start off with two incidents, two anecdotes, and which have been the pillar for our inspiration in this work, which is about transgender persons, Hijra persons, being part of the organized labor force in factories in West Bengal in the decade of the 50s and 60s, in the jute mills, in the jute factories. Which sort of the site of which has formed the backbone of the labor movement in Bengal, if not elsewhere in the country. But this history of Hijra persons being part of the Zanana Kal, which is, I mean, jute mills had their distinctions and divisions, and the Zanana Kal, which is the Zanana factories. Not just in West Bengal, but also in Bihar and present-day Jharkhand. This participation, this history of participation has been invisibilized. It has sort of gone, I mean, it's undocumented. It's undocumented in formal histories of the labor movement. So I wanted to sort of flag that. This participation has suffered a gradual decline since the 70s to an abysmally low and invisible presence currently. The other anecdote that I wanted to sort of flag is the story of a whole unit of Hijra persons who would cycle their way to the Tisco factory in Jamshedpur, the iron and steel company of the Tatas. Why I sort of talk about these is because the world of transgender persons and their work in particular, continues to be invisibilized at the multiple levels in society. This invisibility further obscures their economic role. I mean, significant barriers remain for transgender individuals to enter the world of work or to have access to economic participation. There is very little data. Whatever little data that we've been able to scrape through is the census data. The census data, as well as the data reported in the recently conducted study by the National Human Rights Commission, along with the Kerala Development Society, KDS, in 2018, which is titled as the Human Rights of Transgender as a Third Gender, that's the name of the study, paints this picture regarding the socioeconomic status of transgender and other gender non-conforming persons living in India. 1. The literacy rates amongst those who identified as third gender were found to be about 46%, as compared to the general population's 74%, limiting their scope of finding jobs, accessing other services, and awareness around their own rights. Only 6% of the transgender individuals surveyed during the NHRC KDS study were found employed, that too only in the private and/or NGO sectors. A staggering 92% of the transgender populations are reportedly deprived of the rights to participate in any form of economic activities in India, with 89% of them responding that even skilled and qualified transgender persons and individuals had no employment opportunities and are often refused jobs on the basis of their gender identity and/or expression. We're not just looking at the formal sector. We're looking at the vast majority of trans persons employed in informal sectors, in smaller factories, shops, establishments, karkhanas, in what are home-based industries. Here I'm making a distinction. We are not talking about transgender persons who are self-employed, because we are looking at the employer-employability accountability mechanism, because that is something that is significant in order to press for change. While the NHRC study does not expressly look into sexual and other forms of harassment at the workplace experienced by transgender and gender non-conforming persons, it points to a pattern of discrimination faced by transgender persons within education institutions. And we are sort of culling out and trying to connect the dots. A record 52% of trans persons reported having experienced harassment by fellow students and peers. 15% by students and teachers, and 13% by non-teaching staff. 13% of transgender persons reported experiencing direct sexual assault and harassment within education institutions. So, what does this say? That there is a direct correlation between experiences of harassment within institutions and consecutive experiences of workplace harassment. And this has been sort of pointed out through our work on our ongoing work on economic and social justice issues with transgender women, because we see people are falling through these cracks. Trans persons do not have sufficient skills, are engaged in low-paying jobs, in positions that do not match their skills. Coming to the recent reality of the changes in the legal realities of queer persons' rights in India, verdicts delivered in the NALSA, as well as the Navtej judgment, there is still a great degree of invisibilization when it comes to reflection in data and statistics. In the year 2011, the National Population Census found that there were a total of, and this is a West Bengal figure, 30,349 transgender individuals. The national figure is placed somewhere around 4.9 lakh transgender persons. Transgender and other gender sexual minority rights activists estimated that in reality the number should be at least 6 or 7 times the number reflected in the 2011 census. It is also pertinent to note that the census data on transgender populations prior to the NALSA verdict was collected under the gender category other, and also sort of subsumed within the category of male persons. It was later desegregated. The desegregated data is now available, but when it was sort of being collated and presented, it was clubbed under male. So there is a high chance that the numbers recorded are much lower than in reality. The recent changes in the legal rights scenario in India, however, are not reflected in how transgender and gender non-conforming individuals are perceived by the larger society. That despite these progressive verdicts, the social ostracization the trans persons face hasn't quite taken a back seat. So we can look at the quote in the slide, no, the one before, the first. We know of the Kochi Metro situation, how that has turned out to be a PR exercise for the Kochi Metro Corporation. But what it really does is it really makes trans persons' employability situation very, very vulnerable. Transgender and gender non-conforming persons, often being one of the most visible subsets of the gender sexual minority umbrella, have to face the brunt of violence and discrimination which they are subjected to on the basis of their gender identity and expression, which I don't need to highlight. But for example, the issue of hostility and harassment, including sexual harassment at workplace, experienced by trans feminine, trans masculine, and other gender variant individuals, is significantly underexplored compared to cis feminist organizing work around it for over 2 decades in India. It is also complicated by the fact that scant attention has been paid to locate the experience of transgender individuals' relationship with the labor economy. Transgender communities are the invisible workforce, much like Dalit, migrant, and other precarious workers. And here we are also seeing the flip-flop of the state. I want to show you can we go to the ASI slide? Here we have the notification. It's a notification that came from the ESI, which is the Employee State Insurance Scheme, which is mandatory as per the Employee State Insurance Act, in which the employer contributes 4.75% of the basic wage and the employee contributes 1.5% of their wage towards health benefits. An ESI card holder can avail free health checkup and medical treatment at any of the government EDI clinic or hospital. Now, this is a notification that is dated 8 September 2014, which the ESIC has issued, which talks about inclusion of trans persons within the ESI scheme. But it does not cover, for example, it does not cover sex reassignment surgery. However, that's not, I mean, the health needs for trans persons is not just limited to sex reassignment surgeries. There are heart issues, kidney issues, there are a number of issues. And there are also dependent members of trans persons who are working in these factories, which the ESI schemes also cover. So I think while we see this notification from the ESI, in 2014, in 2015, we see the Labor Ministry taking a progressive step when it acknowledged trans persons' right to equal wages in the Wages Codes Bill. The Union Ministry for Labour for the rationalization of central labour laws, which is a process that's currently undergoing. I don't know if many of you know that there has been a process undergoing for rationalization of the labour laws in this country. So the Union Ministry speaks of trans persons' inclusion in the Code on Social Security and Welfare and the Code on Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions, and proposed amendments to the Factories and Establish Acts. And they proposed to contain specific sections about inclusion of transgender persons and anti-discrimination clauses. Can we go to the slide which talks? No. Yeah. So this was the draft amendment proposals, and the next page sort of lists employment of transgender persons on page 28, but in page 30, which is the next slide, we see this. We see every transgender worker shall have the equal right to work opportunities in a factory. The state government may make rules providing to secure the rights of transgender workers to ensure this, and this. However, these were subsequently dropped on the recommendation of the Law Ministry in 2018. So this is the only mention that we find. I mean, there was a flicker of hope, and then it died. Well, within the Nalsa verdict, and also in the Navtej Johar, but more in the Nalsa verdict, we do see there is a provision of reservation of employment, reservation of for transgender persons on the right to work, but that is only in paper. It's not being implemented. We know of our stories. I wanted to sort of quickly come to the role of trade unions, and presently the importance and economic value of transgender women's labor is greatly undervalued, even within the mainstay of human rights and labor rights movements. And the organizing that takes place. Our conversations with trade union leaders have sort of thrown this light on the fact that they may have some stories of trans workers, but there is no history, there is no conscious record of any organizing movement that involves or includes trans persons' issues within their activism. So anecdotal evidence and case studies with transgender women workers show that they're not even the radar of trade unions. The major trade unions in India bear an unclear attitude towards trans workers. In spite of there being a clear employer-employee relationship, in a majority of cases, unions are yet to accord them worker status. Unions have historically had an uneasy relationship with gender, something that we are all aware of. The inclusion of transgender persons pose a different complexity and challenge to the already fraught space. Even when not hostile, union leaders have stated informally that it is not possible to organize transgender women because they are scattered. I just wanted to sort of go to two more slides. Well, this is also the role of the corporates. There is a growing trend where a lot of corporates are sort of trying to include trans persons and LGBT persons within their inclusion and diversity portfolios. But I'm talking about the large number of trans persons who are not part of this formal sector, who don't go through universities and colleges and get employment in IT companies. Where are we locating them, and how are we sort of locating them? The last slide is something that we came across, and this is something that I wanted to flag. It's the transgender It's a state law commission report of UP, which talks about transgender persons' rights in agricultural land in UP. It's as late as 2019. This is something that which talks about. You see what happens when, I mean, even this was also the reason for the rise of the left in the 70s in Bengal, which was about handing of the land pattas, the handing of the ownership of land to those farmers who worked in those fields. And this is interesting because even now when the current government is giving out land pattas, what about the scores of trans persons who are working as farm labor? Do they get access to these land pattas? Do they get ownership? This is the first instance that we have come across, which is recorded, which talks about trans persons' rights within agricultural land in UP. So these are some of the things that we thought of flagging. I thought of flagging as part of the work that we are currently engaged in, looking at trans persons, their economic participation in labor rights. Thank you.